Hello everyone, welcome to a very spooky Halloween devlog for my game Project Stella. Project Stella is an action platformer blend between Jak and Daxter and The Legend of Zelda. It's my love letter to the games that I used to grow up playing. Today I'm going to be doing a breakdown explanation of how I made this rabbit skeleton model. It's going to be one of the enemies Stella will have to fight on her adventure. Just a quick note before we begin, there are many ways to model a character in 3D. And for personal projects, I would say it's entirely up to how you feel comfortable working. I'm not making any claims that this is the best method. I simply like this method because it's what works for me. So now that we have that out of the way, let's get into sculpting. So whenever I start a sculpt, I usually start off with the block out. I get spheres, cylinders, and cubes into place just to get a general idea of the proportions of the sculpt. It's usually not a good idea to start detailing individual parts before you have everything in place, just because you could be working on one part of the sculpt and then another part or the rest of the sculpt suffers and you realize what you have doesn't entirely work. It's basically just doing all the easy stuff first so that when you work on the harder stuff later, the more detailed stuff, you know that the overall shape is good. Once the block out is done, I start doing a rough sculpt on each bone. This is a little bit more like middle detail, but I'm not really worried about the high detail stuff. I'm just trying to get the overall shape. I'm also not really worrying about getting each bone perfect right away. Every art piece you work on will have an ugly phase, and that's true for all art. Throughout the entire sculpting and modeling phase, and potentially even after that, I will come back to each part of the model and make adjustments where I feel like I need to. I'm also not worried about low detail. I know this is supposed to be kind of like a PlayStation 2 looking character, but I'm going to reduce the detail later when I do like retopology and modeling, simply because I just want to get a good idea of what I'm working on right now. The rib cage is just there to get the overall shape. I'm going to model the ribs over it much later. I'm also taking care to sculpt the characteristics of each bone, even if they won't show up in the final model, like the hook of the ulna, the cylindrical pad of the radius, and the head of the humerus and femur. Also, the scapula is a pretty unique bone, and I think it's worth spending a little bit of extra time to just get the shape correct. All of my reference is off screen. I usually use either Google or PureRef, and then I take images from Google into PureRef. But in this case, I was being quite lazy and I just sort of searched the images I wanted up on Google. The skull is a blend of a human skull and a rabbit skull. We're both mammals, so there are a lot of similarities, but the rabbit skull has some key differences that make this challenging. And it's simply about deciding what parts need to be human-like and what parts need to be rabbit-like. So for instance, obviously the teeth are going to be rabbit-like. The nose is going to be a lot more like a rabbit. I think the orbit and the cheekbone need to be a little bit more like a rabbit. But then when I look at the cranium overall, I think that should be fairly human. Of course, a rabbit skull is much longer, so I'm compressing it a lot closer to what it would look like as a human skull. After I have everything roughly proportioned like a human, except for the skull of course, I modify the sculpt in order to make the skeleton more cartoony. I also adjust the legs in order to make them a lot longer because they're rabbits of course, and if we were to look at Stella, you can see that her legs are long specifically because she's a rabbit. I will probably continue to modify the skeleton later on if the result isn't working for me, if I need to make it a little bit more stylized and cartoony. Now that I already have a high, I guess medium resolution model sculpted, I can model over top to get my PlayStation 2 resolution. This is called Retopology. A few of the methods I use for Retopology are decimating the mesh and adding or removing geometry where I need it. This method is the weakest by far because you're stuck with the mesh you get after decimation. It tends to take longer and doesn't allow for much flexibility. I prefer not to use this method, but I do use it when I need random geometry, like with the rocks in my last video. However, I use it in the pelvis for this model, and I kind of wish I didn't, but I got the general mesh looking fine, so I guess that's okay. For anything cylindrical like arms and legs, and in this case bones, I like to use a curve to generate a mesh. This way I can get a mesh that I can tweak along the shape of whatever I'm retopologizing, and then I can shrink wrap that to fit it to the form of the bone. I also add primitive shapes like spheres and cubes to get the exact shape I'm looking for. You can see this on the head and the humerus and the femur. And then lastly, classic poly retopology. This is great for more complex shapes that need more planning and thought, and it consists of me laying down strips over the mesh to fit the shape and just modeling over top of the sculpt. I use an add-on called Speed Retopo. It has just enough tools to allow for quick retopology, and it's relatively inexpensive, so I recommend it. I tend to mix and match all of these methods throughout the process. No one method is best for all situations. I chose to box model the hands, which is a time saver because hands can be difficult to sculpt. Sometimes I will bring in hands from other models if I need a quick base to get started. But you should keep in mind that while it's easier to copy hands over from another model, it's generally better to make them from scratch anyways. This will keep your practice up and you will be able to improve faster. And when it came to the spine, I took the curve that I had and I converted it to a mesh. And then I adjusted the geometry to make sure that I had definition for each of the vertebrae. And I also used geometry nodes to place each process. After the meshes are finished, I may modify things here and there to further refine the shape. An example is with the skull, where I changed the cheekbone to end further behind the eye, only to bring it forward again because I didn't like it as far back as it was. Before I can start texturing, I have to UV unwrap. Think of this like making a paper model but backwards. I'm making cuts where necessary to instruct Blender on how to unwrap the model in UV space. This is definitely something that I have trouble with when it comes to 3D art. Most of my sculpts on Instagram don't bother with UV unwrapping and texturing. I paint vertex colors and use procedural node materials because I find it easier to work with. However, this isn't good for a model that needs to be animatable in a game engine, so I have to UV unwrap in order to make a texture rather than using procedural stuff and a lot of polygons. So when I do UV unwrap, I like to keep a couple things in mind. One, I use a grid texture to help me see where the texture might be stretching. Two, I tend to treat everything like it's a primitive shape. So in wrapping these bones, I'm treating them like cubes or cylinders. And it's funny how useful primitive shapes are in art. 3, I'm not concerned about breaking a mesh apart into multiple UV islands in order to get a cleaner result. Also, since this is going to be a PS2-like model, I'm making sure to mirror my UVs wherever possible. That way I can reuse the texture on the other side of the model. It's also worthwhile for me to take similar meshes and have them use the same UV space. I'm doing this with all of the ribs and all of the processes? I don't really know. The sticky outy bits on the vertebra. Next, I even the scale of all the islands and use Blender to automatically pack the islands. It doesn't always work, and I tend to have to go in and manually place each island. Once all of that is done, I'm left with a strip of empty space at the top of the texture. I have a pretty good idea of what will go up there, but for now I'm just going to focus on what I have. I begin texturing by creating a procedural material. It's a very simple material that takes the normal of the model and creates a gradient from top to bottom. The normal being the direction that each face is facing, and it's represented by 3 color values: red for X, green for Y, and blue for Z. Everything facing up is white, and everything facing down is black, and everything in between is gray. Then I use a gradient to map the colors I want for the skeleton to give it the appearance of shading. This would be called a zenithal highlight for you mini painters out there. But with one key difference. The skeleton will be moving. So I'm looking to create a zenithal highlight on different sections of the body as well. Since all the bones are still separate objects, I can actually change the orientation of each object. I can do this without actually moving the object itself and simply rotating the origin. You can set this up in the options menu at the top right while in object mode. You just need to set each transformation to affect only the origin. And when I rotate the origin around, it changes the light direction of the material. Now that I have the material and all the objects set up, I can bake out the material into a texture, which will provide me with a base color to get started painting. My goals while I'm hand painting is to add detail and refine the shading. When I'm adding detail, I'm trying to stay conscious of where the light should be coming from for each bone. I'm thinking about basic shapes that make up each bone, coming back to those ever useful primitive shapes to get an idea of how things should look. I'm also looking at my reference and taking inspiration from both human and rabbit skeletons to figure out which details should go where. Mostly human though. The skull took the most work since it has the most detail and the most complicated shape. It's actually made up of a bunch of different bones which are faceted together. Most of the other bones require a bit of blending, with a handful requiring a bit more detail like the scapula and the bones in the arms and legs. With the spine, I use a procedural texture to create a shadow between the vertebrae. Detailing the hand also took a bit of thinking. I need to paint 8 carpal bones over a cube. I'm not entirely happy with how it came out, so I may come back to it at a later date. And similar to the spine, I darken the connection between each of the phalanges, except this time I use a vertex color instead of a procedural texture. I keep all of my hand-painted stuff in a single texture, and I keep that separate from any additional procedural detail, which in this case is only a noise texture over the whole mesh. I also baked an emissive texture for the glow of the eyes that I'll be keeping separate from the main texture. That way I can turn it on and off when the enemy is killed. Unrelated to texturing, I added 2 spheres in the eye sockets to act as emissive objects that create the eye glow of a resurrected skeleton. Finally, we have rigging. Probably the part that most sane people dread. Rigging was made easy for me in this case for 2 reasons. First, Stella has an armature that I can use. There's no good reason to re-rig everything when I can just borrow from another model. Second, the mesh is already separated into bones that correspond with the bones of the rig. Before rigging the skeleton, I need to set the scale of the skeleton. For some reason it was a gigantic 2.5 meters tall when I was done working with it, and I needed to be closer to 1.8 to 2 meters tall. Always remember getting correct scale is very important, because I clearly didn't, and this is a lesson for me to learn. This is also the point where I merged all of the bones together into one object, since the armature was going to move the bones using vertex groups. I was also able to delete all of Stella's extra bones that the skeleton doesn't need, like the face bones, the ear bones, the tongue bones, and an extra knee that was there to give Stella's knee the correct volume it needs. After adjusting the rig to fit the skeleton and deleting all of the unnecessary bones, I weighted all the bones to the mesh to the bones in the armature. This is represented by a heat map of how much influence each armature bone has over the bones in the mesh. So if the mesh is completely red, the bone associated with that heat map has total control over that mesh. Next, I started rigging the parts of the skeleton that needed a bit more care. These are the jaw, the scapula, and the radius. The jaw is pretty simple. The up and down motion of the jaw follows a target bone that is then parented to a corner bone, which is also parented to the opposite corner. When the target bone moves left and right, each corresponding bone rotates to point the jaw in the right direction. That way the rotation follows where the mandible connects with the skull. The scapula is set up to be free-floating above the rib cage. It's parented to the shoulder bone, which is just the clavicle, and it points to a target that is parented to the chest bone. The target then moves back and forward to keep the scapula from colliding with the rib cage. The radius is parented to the humerus. It rotates around to copy the rotation of the hand, and then it stretches to a target parented to the hand bone that keeps it locked to the hand. This isn't realistic in terms of how the radius actually works. It isn't actually pliable enough to do this, but I'm not really concerned about that, since when I'm animating, I'm going to be considering how the bones should move. Also, most animations are fast enough that changes like this are nearly imperceptible. So that's everything. Hopefully I've given you some insight into what I do to make a character. This isn't the only way they can be made, but it's the one that suits me best, and it's also the one that I use to create Stella. I haven't animated the skeleton fully yet, but I'm going to be animating it a bunch in November. I may also be taking a bit of a break from videos since I want to spend a lot of time on my next video, just to make sure it's absolutely perfect. I will finally be talking about my main character Stella, and I've been adding to her very slowly since I made her, so you can expect that video towards the end of November at the very latest. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to support me, you can buy me a coffee at coffee.com/supertrooper. You can also follow me on Instagram at supertrooper_art to see more of my art, like this Zelda model I made a couple months ago that I'm super proud of. And I had kind of been dying to make for like years. So yeah, with that all said, take care everyone, and have a happy Halloween.
Super trooper, super trooper, super trooper, and he sells soup.